Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, which is Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed Hey. We're on Daf Kuf Lamed Daled Omid Beis at the last line. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, we learned in the Brayso, Erla Soy. So the pasuk here tells us of Vayoyma Shmini, on the 8th day, Yimoil Besar Erla Soy. And from this pasuk we actually learn that a bris milah, which takes place on the 8th day, takes place even on Shabbos. We learn that from the word Uvayoim. So the pasuk is going to make the Gemara is going to make a drasha. Why Erla Soy? His Erla. What is the pasuk coming to teach us? The pasuk denotes Erla Soy, only Erla Soy Vadai Deichas HaShabbos, only if it's a definite, if it's an actual, a positive, known Erla. V'lo Safek Deichas HaShabbos, but something which is not definitive, something which entails an uncertainty, that Erla is not something which justifies the Milah to be done on Shabbos. Let's take a look at Rashi inside here on the bottom, on Kuf Lamed Daled, on the base on bottom, 5 lines from the bottom. Says Rashi, Erla Soy Vadei Deichas HaShabbos. The Bahai Kra Ubayayim Hashmini. From this pasuk we learn out the Afina Minei Afilu B'Shabbos. So in this pasuk, from which we learn that Milah is Deichas Shabbos, Ksiv B'Seifei, the pasuk says Erla Soy. The pasuk concludes with the word Erla Soy the Mashma Miuta. It seems to be excluding something. Erla Soy Shal Zeh, only his Erla V'Lo Shal Acher, and we're excluding a different Erla. Ulumute Safek Asa, it's coming to exclude a Safek which cannot be done on Shabbos. Let's continue with the Gemara. So again, Erla Soy V'Adai Deichas HaShabbos V'Lo Safek Deichas HaShabbos. So something which entails a Safek and uncertainty, that does not allow the Milah to be done on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara, Erla Soy V'Adai Deichas HaShabbos. We continue, we learn, needs to be a V'Adai Erla to be Deichas Shabbos, to override Shabbos. V'Lo Adroignus Deichas HaShabbos. This is another example of a Safek, of a uncertainty and adroigness. A baby is born with male and female organs, so he is considered to be a Safek. The bris performed to him does not have a din of a vadai, of a definite bris, and therefore he cannot do it on Shabbos. So the Shita of the Tanakama, Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, he disagrees with androgynous. He says androgynous Deichas HaShabbos, that does justify Chilul Shabbos. We can do the Milah on Shabbos, v'onish kares. And if he disregards his obligation, he incurs kares, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, this will be learned later in the Gemara, he has a pasuk to teach us that an androgynous is obligated to do the Milah, and it's not considered a Safek, it's not considered to be an uncertainty or doubtful Milah, it's considered to be a definitive Milah, and therefore it allows it to be done on Shabbos. The Brayso continues. The Brayso will give us a total of 4 examples of Safek Milah, of Safek Erla. Continues the Brayso, Erla Soy. Once again, we learn from Erla Soy Vadei Deichas HaShabbos, only if it is a Vadei. V'lo Noiled Ben Hashmashos Deichas HaShabbos. We're coming to exclude a case where the child was born Ben Hashmashos. So he was born Friday night during the twilight zone. We're unsure when the next week comes around, which day is precisely his 8th day. We don't know whether it's the Friday, because he was born on Friday, or perhaps he was actually born on Shabbos, and therefore his bris, the 8th day, falls out on Shabbos as well. So since there's an uncertainty as to the exact day of his Milah, we do not do it on Shabbos. Continues the Brayso, Erla Soy Vadei Deichas HaShabbos. So we learn further that only if it's Vadei V'lo Noilad Kishu Mo Deichas HaShabbos, we're coming to exclude a baby who was born Kishu Mol. He was already circumcised. He's missing the foreskin. It appears as though the Milah is already completed there, and a Milah is not really necessary anymore. So we exclude this baby. He cannot undergo a procedure on Shabbos. Now, what would he undergo? Continues the Brayso. Even a baby, a newborn who's born mohul, it appears that he's missing the Erla. So an actual Milah is impractical and unnecessary. However, he needs to go ahead and prick him and drip some dam bris from that area. As Rashi explains, there's a Safek here. According to Beishami, perhaps what we're looking at there, the skin is really the Erla skin, but it's Erla Kvusha. It's suppressed, it's attached to the flesh. Therefore, it still has a din, somewhat of Erla. We can remove it. There's no need to remove it, but something needs to be done at least a partial mila procedure, and hatafas dam bris is regarded as one of the elements of bris mila. Actually, the Rishalmi tells us, we learned it from a pasuk, himol, that hatafas dam bris, drawing some blood during the bris, is actually a requirement. It's part of the mila. We have three parts to the mila, which is the mila itself, cutting off the foreskin, priya, which is uncovering removing the membrane, and then we have hatafas dam bris. So this child who was born with mila, according to Beis Shammai, we're concerned perhaps the skin there is arla kfusha, suppressed arla, and is davik to the basar, is flush with the flesh. It's not regarded as its own separate entity. You don't remove it, but it still has a din of arla somewhat that you need to do some procedure to accomplish and to fulfill the requirement of bris milah. The chiddush here is, even according to Beis Shammai, we don't do this on Shabbos because there's an element of uncertainty here. We're unsure of whether we should regard that skin as arla or not, and therefore it follows the general guideline here, which is that suffix is not done on Shabbos. This child who's noiled mol does not require the hatafas dam bris. We don't regard the skin there as arla kvusha, whether it's not arla at all, or perhaps since it's already attached and davuk to the flesh, it's not its own thing, it doesn't have its own identity, it doesn't stand on its own, it's considered to be ordinary flesh. We don't regard it like arla, and therefore there's no need to do hatafas dam bris. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. Rashi here is on the top of the Amud, beginning with the word androgynous. Safaku. So he's a suffix of whether he requires a bris or not. V'noiled ben hashmashas nami. Suffix manehu. If he was born during ben hashmasha, it's Friday evening. There's an uncertainty as to the exact day of his milah. Suffix manehu. Suffix einiz mane. Comes the next Shabbos. We're unsure whether his 8th day is today, or perhaps it was already yesterday. So there's a suffix there. V'chei noilet shumol is a suffix. Why? Shema erla kvushahi. Perhaps this erla is suppressed to davik b'basar. What you're looking at is erla, but it's davik to the basar, and therefore it requires some sort of procedure. So that's the svara of Beis Shammai, and we still say no, we don't regard it as erla, and there's no hatafas dam bris necessary. Ulkamei parach. Now the Gemara soon will ask, suffix kama asuyimai. The Brisa gave us a list of 4 examples of suffix. We have androgynous, we have ben hashmashes, we have noilet mol, but let's remember the Brisa began with an introduction that loy suffix doiches hashabbos. Now, what type of suffix was the Brisa alluding to that had not yet been mentioned? The Gemara will tell us exactly what's included in the initial opening of the Brisa. So again, Rashi says, soon the Gemara will ask, suffix kama, the first suffix, asuyimai, what is it coming to include? Hoil vetani kol hani sfekis, since it already listed all the other sfekis. Rabbi Doimer, he holds that androgynous is considered to be a vadai mitzvah l'kameyol of milsa. He learns it later on from a pasuk. Shebei Shammai oimrim, this is going to the child who was born with mila. Shebei Shammai oimrim tzarich lahatif. We need to go ahead and drip some blood there. Va'afilu hachi. Even so, moidu de b'Shabbos loidachi. That on Shabbos, it's not doicha because it's considered to be an uncertainty, a suffix, and therefore certainly it doesn't justify overriding Shabbos. Continues the Gemara, actually the Brisa. There's no discussion between Beis Shammai and Basil al noilet shumol on this baby who was noilet kishumol when he already has a bris. Should tzarich lahativ meno dam bris. Certainly a dam bris is required here. Why? We suspect that what we're looking at is a suppressed arla, and it requires some procedure, some bris to be applied to it. And therefore, you need to go and prick it, scrape it, and get some blood out. So according to Reb Shimon, he disagrees with the Tanakama who presents this as a machlokes, as a point of contention between a Shammai who require and Bisl who don't. Reb Shimon Allah says, no, all agree. This is required. Amman echelku. What then do they disagree upon? Al ger shenes gayok shumol. They're disagreeing about a ger, a convert who converted, who did gerus when he already had a milah. Rashi says, for instance, the Aravim who do milah. So he had his milah done when he was still a non-Jew. So he didn't have a proper milah, but he doesn't have the arla. There's nothing you can do about it. Nevertheless, we can do something. You need to go ahead and drip some dam bris to accomplish milah on this fellow. Apparently, Beis Shammai hold that it's not enough that he's missing his arla, that he's missing the foreskin, which is by default. Rather, you need to do something positive. A positive act of bris needs to be applied to this fellow. You need to do hatavas dam bris. So here, despite the fact that there is no erla at all present here, it's not like the child who is nelk shumal, where we discussed earlier, there's an uncertainty as to whether we should view the skin there as erla kvusha. This fellow certainly removed his erla entirely. Nevertheless, Beishamai holds that the absence of erla is not considered like a bris milah. You need to do something positive as well. And since his milah took place when he was a non-Jew, you need to do something now. You need to be meitiv dam bris. No. There's no need to do that. As long as he's missing his arla, he's clean, he's free of any arla whatsoever, there's no concern. So according to Beis Hillel, there's no need necessarily to do something positive in this case, since he does not have his arla altogether. Continues the Gemara Amamar, we just learned, V'loi safek doichas haShabbos. We learned from the pasuk arla soy. It's coming to exclude something, an uncertainty. When there's a suffix, then does not allow to be doicha Shabbos. Lasuya mai, what is it coming to include? Lasuya the Tanur Abanan, to include the following halacha in the Brisa: Ben Shiva mechalel n'olav Shabbos. So a uber, a fetus, a 7-month fetus, which is deemed to be something which will survive and viable, we can go ahead and be mechalel Shabbos to do his bris milah, because a bris milah is required for this child. Uben ches, however, a uber, a fetus, who's only an 8-month fetus, is deemed to be something which won't survive, and therefore there's no mitzvahs milah. Ein mechal n'olav haShabbos. So we can't do the mitzvahs milah on Shabbos. It doesn't justify chilul Shabbos. Now, what if there's a suffix of how long the uber has been in the womb? Suffix ben zayin, suffix ben ches. We're unsure whether he was there for 7 months or 8 months. Ein mechal haShabbos. This is a suffix which the Brisa was referring to. We can't do chilul Shabbos for his bris milah, since there's a suffix of whether at all there's an obligation of bris milah. Continues the Brisa, ben shmoina. If we are certain that he is an 8-month fetus, harayu ke'even, regarding like a stone, v'asal tatlo, he's muktzah, he can't move him on Shabbos, because he's not going to survive. He doesn't have a din of a person. Aval imay sheikh olav manikasle, but his mother can lean over him and nurse him on account of sakana. Rashi says that it's something which it puts the mother in danger, since the abundance of chalav, of milk, which she can't release, it endangers her, brings her to chaylit, to sickness. So on account of that, we allow her to bend over and feed the child. As Taisus points out, we're not concerned that perhaps she's going to be metaltal, move the child while she's doing it. Now Taisus points out that nowadays, achshav mutal metaltal, kol tinoikis, we may go ahead and move any child, any baby, because we're not so bucky, we're not so knowledgeable as to the exact age of incubation of this baby, and we regard them as viable babies. And Taisus says that even if we know for certainty that it's an 8-month fetus, we just assume that he's really a 7-month fetus, but he lingered around, he stayed in there a little while extra, so we give him a din of ben shiva, and therefore we are allowed to move him. And Taisus actually points out that milah wouldn't be an issue altogether, to actually do the milah on Shabbos. Why? Mimanav shach. Either way, you're okay. Why? Because if he's a bar chiyuva, if there's an obligation to do the milah on this child, then certainly it allows it to be done on Shabbos. Now, if he's really a child who won't survive, then there's no malacha taking place, because you're merely being mechatech basar ba'alma, you're merely cutting flesh, like dead flesh. What's the point of chabura? What's the malacha of bris? It's a chabura, you're taking blood out and you're making a wound, so it's a malacha of an atilas neshama, you're drawing out neshama, life which is embedded in the blood. But this child who's not viable, won't survive, is not regarded as a true neshama, as a true life. So there's no malacha taking place either way. Therefore, Taisus says there's no concern of doing milah on any newborn child. Okay, so in summary, the Brisa told us, we learned from the pasuk Orla Soy, which denotes that only a specific type of Orla, which is definitive, allows the milah to be done on Shabbos, but not a suffix. The Brisa lists us 4 cases, examples of suffix. We have the suffix Ben Shmoyne Chadashim. We're uncertain whether the newborn was really only an 8-month fetus. We have an androgynous who exhibits the signs of a Zachar and Nekeva. So according to Shita of the Tanakama, the Chiv there is only misafik. We have the Noilad ben Hashmashers, born Friday evening. We're unsure whether the 8th day falls out the coming Friday or the coming Shabbos. And we have Noilad Kishu Mol. So it appears that he had a Brit, that he's missing his Erla. He was circumcised, and in which case, according to Beis Shammai, despite the fact that there's a chiyuv to do Hatavas Dam Bris, but that's not done on Shabbos, since it involves a suffix, we're unsure whether to regard that skin as a Erla or not. So all these 4 cases are sfekes, uncertainties, and doubts which don't allow the Milah to take place on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara back to the discussion about the Nilachu Mol. Itmar we learned. Rav Amar halachah Tanakama. So the Brisa told us we have 2 approaches to Noilad Kishehu Mol. We have the Tanakama who maintains that it's actually a machlokes between Beis Shammai who require dripping that dam bris and Beis Hillel who don't require it. Whereas according to Rav Shimon ben Lazar, all agree that Hatavas dam bris is an obligation. The machlokes is merely regarding a ger. So the question is, how do we rule? What does the halacha follow? Itmar we learned to Rav Amar halacha Tanakama. Halacha follows the Tanakama, who holds that according to Beis Hillel, there's no chiyuv to do Hatavas dam bris on a child who was born already with a milah. Ushmol Amar halacha Rav Shimon ben Lazar holds that even according to Beis Hillel, there's a chiyuv to do Hatavas dam bris. Continues the Gemara, Rav Ada bar Ava is yaladle how yenuka kishu mol. So this child was born with a milah to Rav Ada bar Ava. Ahadra atleisa molay. So evidently he held that you must go ahead and do Hatavas dam bris even to a noilat kishu mol. So he made the rounds amongst 13 moyalim. Ahadre, he took him around atleisa molay to 13 moyal, and nobody wanted to do the milah because it was on Shabbos. And even the shita that requires Hatavas dam bris does not allow it to be done on Shabbos. It's a suffix. Now he evidently held that it's considered to be a vadai, a definitive chiyuv, a vadai obligation. Therefore, it must be done on Shabbos as well. But nobody agreed with him, so he was forced to do it himself. The father was forced to do it himself. Adeshavi krushavcha, until he made him a krushavcha, he mutilated him, he harmed him, he damaged the aver as a result of his doing the attempting to do the Hatavas dam bris. Omar, Sir Adabar Abba, the father exclaimed. He said, Teisili, I'm deserving of this punishment, the Avri Adarav, because I transgressed the words of Rav, who holds that the halacha follows the Tanakama, where according to Beis Hillel, there's no requirement to do Hatavas dam bris, and I was over on that, therefore I suffered as a result. Amalei Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman responded to him, Avad Shmuel Avar, you weren't over on Shmuel, meaning you maintain that you were only over on Rav because according to Beis Hillel, there's no need to do this. Whereas according to Shmuel, all agree that there's a chiyuv to do Hatavas dam bris. Says Rav Nachman, you weren't over on Shmuel, you were over on Shmuel. Why? Aim or Damar Shmuel. When did Shmuel say that Hatavas dam bris is a requirement for a teenage shenel kishu mol? That's only b'choil, during ordinary weekday. B'Shabbos mi amar. However, on Shabbos, did he then say that one should do Hatavas dam bris? Certainly not, because it's only a suffix. It's a suffix erla. We're not sure whether to regard the skin there as having the status of erla or not, so we do that Hatavas dam bris to cover all bases. But it's not something which justifies Chilul Shabbos. So you were over not only on Rav, you were over on Shmuel as well. Says the Gemara, but who savar? Rav Ada bar Ava he held, Vadai erla kfushahi. We do regard it definitively as a suppressed erla, which requires Hatavas dam bris. This is a chiddush. This is a new approach to the sugya. He holds it's not a suffix, it's a vadai, and therefore Hatavas dam bris is a necessity, is an obligation, even will be done on Shabbos. The Itmar, as we learned, to Rabba Amar Chashinan Shema Orla Kvushi. Rabba maintains that even the shita that holds that you do Hatavas dam bris, it's only on account of a chashash, Chashinan. We're concerned whether perhaps this is considered to be a suppressed erla, but it's only a suffix and doesn't justify a malach on Shabbos. Rav Yosef Amar Vada erla kfushahi. We consider this to be a definite erla kvusha, and therefore it is done on Shabbos. Rav Yosef Mina Aminala. How do I know this concept that the erla here is considered to be Vada erla? This Sanya, as we learned in the Brisa. Rav Lezer Kapo Imer. He disagrees with the Tanakama of this Brisa that we're going to learn. And he says, look, there's no disagreement between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel al noilak kishu mol shetzorach lahativ menu dam bris. There's no discussion, certainly. They both agree, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, that this child who is noilad mol requires Hatavas dam bris. Man nechlaku. What then is there a machlekes about lechalol v'sas Shabbos? Whether or not you are mechal Shabbos. Beis Shammai mechal no v'sas Shabbos. Shammai hold that this requirement is a vadai. We regard this orla as a vadai orla and justifies chilul Shabbos. They regard it as merely a doubt, an uncertainty, a suffix. Therefore, we do not do it on Shabbos. So this is the opinion of who? Of Eliezer HaKapper. Now he's directing his argument. He's confronting the Tanakama of this brisa, which we don't really have here, but he's addressing this to the Tanakama. And we can infer from here, we have a diuk, that there's an opposing view to Eliezer HaKapper. La Mechlal the Tanakama Savar. Apparently Tanakama disagrees with him. He holds that all agree, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both concur that the Atavas Abris is a requirement, but not only a requirement, but it's a Vadai Chiv, and we are Machal in all of us Shabbos. That seems to be the point of contention between Reb Eliezer HaKapper and the Tanakama. So this is a source for Rav Yosef that we see. We see that the Tanakama maintains that even according to Beis Hillel, the Atavas Abris is required b'Torah's Vadai. It's a definitive Chiv. We regard this Orla as certainly present there, and therefore it allows Chilul Shabbos. So this is the source of this opinion. Says the Gemara. How do you know? Perhaps we can reinterpret the Brisa. V'dilma, perhaps Tanakama Divrakol ein Mechalon Kamar. Certainly there's some sort of machlekes, but perhaps just the opposite. The Tanakama holds that all agree that there is no Chilul Shabbos allowed, because all agree that this is not considered to be a Vadei Orla. Whereas Reb Eliezer HaKapper holds, yes, there is a machlekes. Beis Shammai hold yes Chilul Shabbos, and Beis Hillel hold no Chilul Shabbos. So how do you know that there's any shita that holds, that maintains that according to Beis Hillel, this is considered to be a Vadei Orla which justifies Chilul Shabbos? Says the Gemara, if that's the case, if that's the case, that according to the Tanakama, all agree that it's merely a suffix, and we are not Mechalel Shabbos. So what is Reb Eliezer HaKapper coming to introduce to us? What is he coming to teach us? He's coming to teach us that according to Beis Shammai, it is a Vadai, and we are Mechalel Shabbos, because he agrees that according to Beis Hillel we don't. So what is he coming to dispute? What is he coming to present for us? Im Kain Reb Eliezer HaKapper, Tama de Beis Shammai or Salashminan? He's coming to tell us that according to Beis Shammai we are Mechalel Shabbos. As Rashi points out, it's unreasonable to say that that's the purpose of Reb Eliezer HaKapper, because generally we say that Beis Shammai b'makom Beis Hillel ain't a Mishnah, meaning the opinion of Beis Shammai, in contrast to Beis Hillel, has no authority, is not considered to be a Mishnah, meaning it doesn't carry weight. So it doesn't seem to be plausible that Reb Eliezer HaKapper would be coming to teach us the opinion of Beis Shammai. Says the Gemara, no, perhaps this is the pshat. Dilma Achi Ka'amar. Perhaps this is the pshat. They're not discussing. The Tanakama is not discussing Chilul Shabbos. Perhaps the dispute between the Tanakama and Reb Eliezer HaKapper is regarding the obligation to do the Atavas Abris during a weekday. That's the point of machlekes here. Tanakama holds that the entire chiv, the entire concept of Atavas Abris is dependent upon the opinions of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai require, Beis Hillel don't require during an ordinary weekday. Whereas Reb Eliezer HaKapper disagrees. He says, Hachi Kamar, lo yinechloku Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel b'davar zeh. There's no machlekes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel regarding the concept, the actual requirement to do Atavas Abris. They both agree it's a requirement. Machlekes is merely whether it's Vadai or not Vadai. According to Beis Shammai, it's a Vadai Chiv, which justifies Chilul Shabbos. According to Beis Hillel, not. But all agree that there is a Chiv during an ordinary weekday to do Atavas Abris. And this is in contrast to the Tanakama, who maintains, no. This in itself is the point of contention. Beis Shammai require Atavas Abris during an ordinary weekday. Beis Hillel don't require. But certainly, the Tanakama would not suggest that there is a Vadai Chiv here, and would not allow Chilul Shabbos. And indeed, we basically undid the Raya of Rav Yosef. We have no more proof from this Brisa that there is a justification for Chilul Shabbos to do the Atavas Abris. So in summary, a child who is Noilat Keshuhu Mol, we have the Tanakama, we have Rav Shimon Elazar. Rav holds that the halacha follows the Tanakama, who holds that Beis Shammai require hatavas dam bris. The fact that there's no visible, discernible arla, that's not enough for us. We're concerned perhaps that what we're looking at is really arla, therefore, although you don't remove it, we do some act of bris, which is the hatavas dam bris, you remove some blood from the area. According to Beis Hillel, if he doesn't have his arla, we don't look at the skin there as though it's arla, and it doesn't require any hatavas dam bris. Shmuel says the halacha follows Reb Shimon Elazar, who holds that according to all shittas, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, we have an uncertainty. Perhaps this arla is considered to be arla. It's merely stuck to the flesh. It's davak b'basar, but it has somewhat of a status of arla. Therefore, something needs to be done to it, some change, some modification, some adjustment. Therefore, we go ahead and we prick it. We take out some blood, and thereby we are makayim, fulfilling the mitzvah of milah. Now, the Gemara proceeded that there is actually a disagreement between Rabbi and Rav Yosef whether the din of hatavas dam bris is merely based on an uncertainty, whether or not we regard the skin there as arla. That's Rabbi's opinion, and therefore it certainly doesn't justify it to be done on Shabbos. Whereas Rav Yosef maintains that the shita that requires hatavas dam bris holds that it is a vaday arla. He brought a raya from a Tanakama and the Brisa. It's a vaday arla which allows chilul Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. Amar Avasi, kol she'imay tmei leida, any child whose mother observes the tumas leida. We know that a mother who gives birth to a boy, she is tummy for 7 days. So any child whose mother needs to undergo the tumas leida, nima l'shmoina, this child will have his bris on the 8th day. V'chol she'ein imay tmei leida, any child whose mother is not tummy with tumas leida, ein nima l'shmoina, he will not have his bris on the 8th day. For instance, a case of a yotzei doifin, a child who was delivered by cesarean. His mother does not have tumas leida, and therefore his bris will not take place on the 8th day. He doesn't need to wait for 8 days. Rashi says, nimo yad, you do the bris, you meant to do it immediately. What is the connection between both things? Shenemar, because the pasuk says in the beginning of Parshat Tazria, Isha ki Tazria v'yolda zachar, she'll have a baby zachar v'tama shivas yomim. That's how the pasuk begins, and then the next pasuk says, Vayoy ma'ashmine yimo b'sara lasei. So we want to connect both things. When there is tumas leida, then the milah takes place on the 8th day. Amali Abaye. So Abaye responded, the earlier generations, meaning from the time of Avram Avinu, where they began the bris milah, up until the Torah was given, they did bris despite the fact that they did not observe tumas leida. So they did bris on the 8th day despite the fact that no tumas leida. So apparently the two things are not related. The early generations will highlight and clarify for us the fact that the fact is that his mother did not observe tumas leida, and the child had his bris on the 8th day. Armalei, so Ravasi responded, "Can we get raya from prior to Matan Torah, Nitna Torah?" So when the Torah was given, Nischadsha halacha, the halacha was taught to us and presented to us, introduced to us, that the two things are really connected. Rav Chaim Brisker learns that the Gemara's kasha was fine. We cannot say that today's chiyuv of bris milah should take place on the 8th day because there's no tumas leida. But what about observing the chiyuv bris milah on account of the mitzvah's bris milah, which was given to Avram Avinu prior to Matan Torah? So on account of that, we should go ahead and do the bris milah on the 8th day. Let's fulfill that mitzvah's bris. So he responded, you can't do that. That was only applicable before Matan Torah. Today, we observe bris milah as it was presented to us in the Torah, and the two things are really connected. Tumas leida is connected with the 8th day bris. Eini, says the Gemara, is that so? That two things are related? V'itma, we learned, yoytze daifen, so a child which was born in a non-conventional manner, delivered by cesarean, or a case of umishi yesh shtei arles, a child who has 2 arles, Rashi says, double skin, or he has 2 gidin, 2 veins, 2 ivarim. So we have a machlekes of whether or not the bris on these individuals allows chilul Shabbos. Rav Huna, Rav Chia bar Rav, we have machlekes between Rav Huna and Rav Chia bar Rav. Chad Amar once said, mechal and all of Shabbos. We do the bris for these individuals even on Shabbos. V'chad Amar ein mechalin, we do not do the bris on Shabbos. So there are two different situations here. We have the Shtei Arlois, in which it appears that one of them is the real one of them is the not real Arla. There's a suffix here. There's an uncertainty of which one is the Arla, which one is not. So we must do both of them. There's a chiv to actually do the milah on both of them. But since there's some sort of element of suffix, we're not sure which is the real one, we can't do it on Shabbos. So this is one approach. The other approach is, well, at the end of the day, you need to do both to fulfill your obligation. So perhaps we regard both of them, cutting both arlas, as though it's just one procedure. It's like the tzitzin. We discussed the other day, the tzitzin ha'ma'akvin samila. So it's a similar concept that we must do both. Although one is a real one is not, we must do both in order to fulfill the obligation. So therefore, it's considered to be like one unified act of milah, and it allows it to be done on Shabbos. Whereas the other shita says no, since one is the true arla, one isn't, we don't know which one it is, therefore we cannot do milah on either one on Shabbos. So that's the discussion regarding the double arla. Now what pertains to us is the case of the yotzei doifen, the child who was born by cesarean. So one shita holds, we do the milah even on Shabbos. The other shita holds, we don't do the milah even if the 8th day falls on Shabbos, we don't do it on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, ad kan lo pligi. Now this discussion, this machlekes, only pertains ela l'chalav Shabbos, only with regard to allowing chilul Shabbos. So one holds you do it, one holds you don't. Avol l'shmoina vada merlinle. But apparently all agree that despite the fact that he's a yotzei doifen, he was delivered by cesarean, the meal will take place on the 8th day. It's pretty clear from the wording here. It's only a discussion regarding chilul Shabbos. But the milah takes place on the 8th day, despite the fact that this child born in a non-conventional manner does not obligate his mother to observe the Tumas Leida. Says the Gemara, Haba Hatalia. One is dependent on the other. They're actually both interrelated, meaning the shita that holds that we don't do the milah on this child who is a yotzei doifen, we don't do it on Shabbos. You know why? Because despite the fact that today's his 8th day, he does not have a din of an 8-day milah. So that's the basis for his prohibition, for the issa of doing his milah on Shabbos. Whereas the other shita maintains, even this child who was born in a non-conventional manner, in which the mother does not have tumas leida, his milah is still on the 8th day, and therefore it allows and justifies chilul Shabbos. So it appears indeed that this question of whether the 8-day bris depends on tumas leida is actually dependent on these two amiroim. Says the Gemara Tanoi. In fact, we seem to have a machlekes tanoim in this regard. Says the Bryce, Yesh yilid bayis shenima le'echad. This is speaking about a slave, a young newborn slave. And the Bryce says there's a yilid bayis, a slave which was born in the home of the Jew, shenima le'echad. His bris will take place right away on the 1st day. There's no need to wait for 8 days. V'yesh yilid bayis shenima le'shmoina. On the other hand, we have a case of a yilid bayis, whose milah will take place specifically on the 8th day. Perhaps let's take a look at Rashi inside, who gives us a proper introduction to this whole subject here. Rashi here is in the middle of the Amid, just about, beginning with the words Yesh yilid bayis shenimu le'echad. Explains Rashi. The Trei Kroi Ksivi. We have 2 psukim written which discusses bilid bayis or miknas kesef. We have 2 psukim which describe the milah, the circumcision of the Eved, who is either a Yilid Bayis, born in the Bayis to the family of the Yisrael, and we have Miknas Kesef. We have a Eved who was purchased by the Yisrael. So the pasuk tells us that Milah is meant to be applied to both types of slaves, both types of newborn slaves. Now the 2 psukim are a bit different. One pasuk contains the number 8. The bris is meant to take place on the 8th day. The other pasuk leaves it open. There's no requirement of waiting to the 8th day. Chad ksiv beches. One pasuk mentions the 8th day. V'chad, another pasuk, lo ksiv beches, does not mention ches. What are the 2 psukim? Says Rashi, Himol yilid beischa, u miknas kaspecha. So the yilid bayis and the miknas kesef are meant to have a milah. That pasuk does not have a mention of 8. V'lo mefarsh be'leches yamim. Uksiv, we have another pasuk. Uben shmoinas yamim, the 8-day-old baby. Yimol lachem kol zachar lidaresechem. Yilid bayis. This is the slave which was born into the Jewish home. Umiknas kesef, or alternatively, he was purchased. The pasuk here mentions the bris on the 8th day. Says Rashi, Mustaver, it is logical, it is a svara to say, the Haidim Mefarish B'Lishmoina, when the pasuk mentions 8, apparently that's referring to a slave, a newborn slave, which is similar. He has some similarity to a Yisrael Ma'aliyah, to a conventional Yid Yisrael Shanel Bebeisish Yisrael Mishekanai, who was born. So the slave, this newborn slave, was born in the bias of Yisrael Mishekanai. After it was bought, meaning that the delay that the actual birth took place within the family, within the household of the Yisrael, and that newborn slave requires his meal to be done on the 8th day. The dumi de lachem ba'inan. It needs to be similar to lachem, to a Jewish-born child. Because in that pasuk it says, Yima lachem kol zachar. It begins, Yima lachem kol zachar. To you, for you. It needs to be similar to the conventional Yisrael who's born within the Jewish home and household. So it begins with the word lachem and then proceeds with the yilid bayis, born in the Jewish home, miknas kesef, purchased by the Yisrael. So we make that distinction, that apparently the requirement of the milah on the 8th day applies to a lechem child, to a slave which is born in a manner which symbolizes and is similar to the newborn Yisrael. He's born within the Jewish home, household, as opposed to the Eved, which does not fit that criteria. Says Rashi Hilkach, as a result of this interpretation, we have various scenarios and various halachas. In the case of Lokach Shivchamu Beres, he purchased a slave maiden, a female servant, speaking about non-Jewish of course, and she was already expectant, she was Muberes, V'yolda, and then she gave birth, after he purchased her. Hareza Miknas Kesef. In this case, the child, the newborn, is regarded as Miknas Kesef, purchased. Why? Because he purchased the Shivcha when she was already expecting. The Guf Shalom, who b'mei imay, this fetus is regarded as a Guf Shalom in the womb of his mother, V'kanai, and he purchased the actual child. So this is a Miknas Kesef. The purchase pertained to the child himself. This child will have a meal on the 8th day. Shenim olaches. Why? The dum yedalachemu. Shenol b'shusay Yisrael. Since he was born within the confines, in the possession of the Yisrael, it is similar to lachem, to the Jewish-born child, to the standard, typical Jewish child, and therefore his meal takes place on the 8th day. However, lokach shivcha uvlada ima. He purchased a shivcha who is bringing along her child who is already born. Shekva yodasai. In this case, even though 8 days have not yet passed from the day of his birth, he immediately does the milah. Why? Because this is not similar to lachem. He was already pre-born. He wasn't born into the possession, into the rishus of the Yisrael. So this case is a miknas kesef, which requires the milah to be done immediately. Now, we addressed 2 types of miknas kesef. Now we're going to address the case of Yilid Bayis. Says Rashi, Lokach Shivcha v'nesabra etzlei. So he purchased the Shivcha and she became expectant when she was already in his possession. Lo yahavi ubar miknas kesef. This ubar, this fetus, this newborn is not a miknas kesef. Elo Yilid Bayis. He's born into the home of the Yid, meaning he wasn't purchased, because the purchase took place prior to his arrival, prior to her becoming expecting with him. So this is not considered to be miknas kesef. This is yilid bayis. It's a child, an offspring of a shivcha. So it's a slave who was born to the home of a yid. It's a yilid bayis shenimo leches. He will have his milah likewise on the 8th day. Why? The dumi de lachemu, because he is similar to lachem. It's similar to your typical Jewish-born child. He was born into the possession, into the household of the yid. So we have 3 cases. We have 2 cases of miknas kesef, purchased. One is milah b'shmini, one is milah immediately. And we have the case of Yilid Bais, who was an unpurchased child, and his milah will take place on the 8th day, since he was born into the home of the Yid, it's lachem. We're missing one case of Yilid Bais, who will have his milah on day 1. Says Rashi, will come in Mefarish. Soon the Gemara will explain what is the example of Yilid Bais, Hanimul Echad Aliba de Tanakama. Let's get back to the Gemara. We are 6 lines from the top. Kitanoi, we're going to find the machlekes tanoim of whether or not the din of the 8th day bris is related and connected on the din of the mother observing a tumas leda. Says the Brisa, Yesh Yilid Bayis Shenimul Echad. We have a case of an Eved who is a Yilid Bayis, born into the home of the Yid, whose Mila will take place immediately on the first day, with no need to wait 8 days. V'yesh Yilid Bayis Shenimul Shmoina. We have a case of a Yilid Bayis who will have his Mila specifically on the 8th day. Yesh Miknas Kesef Shenimul Echad. We have a case of a slave who was purchased, and his Mila will take place on his first day. Likewise, we have a purchased slave whose Mila will take place on the 8th day. So this is an introduction to the Brisa. We have 4 scenarios, 2 by Yilid Bayis and 2 by Miknas Kesef. Explains the Brisa. Yesh Miknas Kesef Shnimul Echad. We have a purchased newborn whose Mila will take place immediately on the first day. V'yesh Miknas Kesef Shnimul Shmoina. We have a purchased slave whose Mila will take place on the 8th day. Ketzad. What is the scenario? Lokach Beres, he purchased an expectant maidservant. She's already expecting when he purchased her. In this case, the purchase pertains to the Uber himself. V'achach Yoldan, afterwards she gave birth. Zeo Miknas Kesef. So this Uber, this newborn, was purchased by the Yisrael. This is a Miknas Kesef, and Imul Shmaina, who will have his meal on the 8th day, since he was born into the Rishus, into the possession, into the household of the Yisrael. So it's Dumi Talachem, it's similar to the Jewish born child. His meal takes place on the 8th day. However, Lokach Shivcha, Uvlade Ima, he purchased the Shivcha, and she brought along her Vlad, who was already born previously. So he purchased the newborn as well, but it wasn't born here. So this is a case of Zui Miknas Kesef, a purchased newborn, Shanima Le'echad, who will have his Mila on the first day, since this is not Dumiyat Lachem, he wasn't born into the household of the Yid, so his Mila takes place immediately. Continues the Brisa. So we discussed 2 cases of purchased slaves, Miknas Kesef. What about Yilid Bayis, the unpurchased slave? V'yesh Yilid Bayis Shenim L'Shmoina. We have the Yilid Bayis whose meal will take place on the 8th day. Ketzad. What is that? Lokach Shivcha v'nesaber etzloi. She purchased a Shivcha and she became expectant when she was already in the possession of the Yisrael. So there was no purchase on the Uber. He wasn't there at the time of purchase. She became expecting later. V'yod, and then she gave birth. That's Zeo Yilid Bayis. This is an example of a Yilid Bayis, an unpurchased slave, a newborn who was born into the Rishus of Yisrael, Hanimul Shmoina, who will have his Mila on the 8th day, and we're missing one more case of the Yilid Bayis, who will have his Mila immediately, and the Gemara later will illustrate that for us. So this is the Shita of who? Of the Tanakama, who says there's no difference of whether the mother has Tumas Leda or doesn't have Tumas Leda. The din of the Mila on the 8th day is totally irrelevant and independent of the din of the Tumas Leda of the mother. Rav Chama Omer, no, it depends on exactly that detail. So she gave birth and then he was matvil the shivcha. So what happened was they used to send her to the mikvah, she would immerse with the tvilas avdus, which makes her into the eved of the Yisrael and obligates her to do mitzvahs like a Jewish woman. So it's like a partial gerus. The Rambam calls it Yotzu Mechal Hagoyim. They left the confines of the Gentiles, Uchlal Yisrael Lebo, but they haven't yet entered into the confine, into the Klal of Klal Yisrael. So some sort of they're in limbo, some sort of twilight zone. That's the purpose of the tefillah of Avdus. She's a slave made of Yisrael. She's subordinate to Yisrael. She's battled to Yisrael. She has some sort of connection to Yisrael, to Yiddishkeit, and she needs to do mitzvahs. So Rav Chama says, look, it depends on what happened first. We're speaking about, of course, a shivcha who was purchased, and then she was an saber, she became expectant. So it depends what happened first. If she had the tefillah and then the leda, in which case she was already chayev mitzvahs when she gave birth, and tumas leda she needed to observe. This is a case where the child will have his bris milah on the 8th day. But let's see inside. Rav Chama Omer, Yolda v'achachachiv tvila, if she first gave birth and then she did tvila. Zeu yilid bayis shnimah le'echad. In this case, during the leda, she was not yet observing tumas leda. She wasn't yet a yid. She wasn't mechayiv mitzvahs. She wasn't even a partial yid. Nothing. So there was no tumas leda. So since at the time of the childbirth there was no tumas leda to the mother of the child, Zeu yilid bayis shnimah le'echad. This is a newborn slave who was born into the Rishus of Yisrael, who has his milah le'echad on the first day. However, so first, if she did the tefillah and then she gave birth, in which case, during the time of childbirth, she was already observing Tumas Leida. Zeo Yilid Bayis Hanem L'Shmoina. This child has his meal on the 8th day. So apparently, according to Rav Chama, the two things are very much related. Din of the 8th day bris is related and dependent upon the Tumas Leida of the mother. V'Tanakama. Tanakama absolutely doesn't differentiate between Bein Tefillah v'Achach Yoda, whether the Tefillah took place and then the Leida, or Bein Yoda v'Achach Tefillah, whether there was a Leida first and then the Tefillah, the Afagav, the Enima Leida. Although the mother does not have Tumas Leida, in the case where she gave birth and then she was Toivel, Nima L'Shmoina, the Mila takes place on the 8th day, and indeed, these two opinions reflect those two sides of the coin. According to Tanakama, the Tumas Leida of the mother and the 8th day bris are unrelated. According to Rav Chama, they're very much connected. Now the Gemara will analyze for us and list for us exactly what are the 4 cases which we began, which the Brisa introduced us to. Bishlein Rav Chama, it's all good and well according to Rav Chama, we find 4 cases. Mishkachas la Yilid Bayis Nimul Echad. We find a case of a Yilid Bayis who will have his meal on the first day. A Yilid Bayis, an unpurchased slave, Nimul Ches, who will have his meal on the 8th day, as we just discussed. Miknas Kesef Nimul Echad. We have a purchased slave who will have his meal on the first day. Umiknas Kesef, a purchased slave, Nimul Ches, who will have his meal on the 8th day. Explains the Gemara. How are we going to have all 4 cases according to Rav Chama as follows. Yoda V'Achachit Vila. So if he purchased this slave and then she became expectant, so she gave birth and then she did the tefillah. This is a Yilid Bayis, Zeo Yilid Bayis Shnimula Echad, because at the point of Leida, she was not yet obligated in Tumas Leida. Hit tefillah b'Achach Yoda, but first came the tefillah and then the Leida, Zeo Yilid Bayis Shnimula Ches, because at the point of Leida, she was Tamei Tumas Leida, she had already been Toivel, she has the Chiyuvim of a Jewish woman. In this case, certainly the child who was born into the home of a Yid will have the bris milah on the 8th day. So these are 2 examples of Yilid Bayis. What about 2 examples of Miknas Kesef, of the purchased slave? Miknas Kesef, Nimel Shmoina, is Kigoin, for instance, Shalaka Shifcha Muberes. He purchased an expectant slave maiden, V'yit Vila, then he sent her to immerse in the mikvah. So now she's obligated in the mitzvahs, she has Tumas Leida v'Achach Yoda, and afterwards she gave birth, in which case we have this child who was actually purchased by the Yisrael because she was already Mu'beres at the time of purchase. She purchased this newborn child. Now since at the time of childbirth the mother was observing Tumas Leida, this child will have his bris on the 8th day. However, Miknas Kesef Lima La'echad, a purchased newborn who will have his bris on day 1, is Kegoin, will be in the following case. Shalokach Zeh Shifcha v'Zeh Ubra. So 2 people split the deal. One person, Ruvain, purchased the Shifcha, and Shimon purchased the fetus, the Ubar. In which case, we say, well, the Ubar is Miknas Kesef. He was purchased by the Yid, but there won't be any Milah on the 8th day. Why? Because, as Rashi told us, the 8th day bris milah by a slave is only when it's Dumya de Lachem. It needs to be similar to the Leida, to the birth of a Jewish child. In this case, where Shimon merely has possession and ownership of the Uber, not of the mother, so it's not considered to be Dumid Lachem. It wasn't born into his possession. The mother, it wasn't his mother. She didn't give birth in a manner which is similar to the Yisrael, because the mother here is not part of the equation. He simply has possession of the child, independent of the mother. So it's not similar to a conventional childbirth. It's not considered like it's his birth, because the mother is not his. So in this case, the milah will take place on day 1. So we understand all 4 cases according to Rav Chama. Elo Tanakama, however, according to the Tanakama, this is what Rashi mentioned earlier, we're missing 1 case according to Tanakama. We have all those 3 cases, as we mentioned earlier. Elo Yilid Bayis Nimul Echad. However, we're missing 1 case. A Yilid Bayis, a child who was born into the home of the Yid, an unpurchased newborn slave. Nimul Echad, who will have his meal on the first day. How could we find that type of situation? Because according to Rav Chama, since the mother had given birth prior to her tefillah, so at the point of childbirth there was no Tumas Leida. Rav Chama maintains the 8th day bris is related to Tumas Leida. Therefore, in this case, the bris will take place on day 1. But according to the Tanakh, who disregards that factor, he holds that it's irrelevant. Of whether the tefillah took place before the Leda or the childbirth before the tefillah, 2 months Leda and an 8th day bris are unrelated. So how can we have a case of a child, a newborn slave, born within the confines of the Jewish home, who will have his bris only on day 1? Omar of Yirmiyah was speaking about the case of B'leikeach Shivcha L'Ubra. He purchased a Shivcha, but didn't actually purchase the Shivcha itself. He purchased the rights to have the offsprings of the Shivcha, the product of the Shivcha. So since he doesn't have an actual kinyan acquisition in the Shivcha herself, it's not considered to be his childbirth. It's not dumiyah telachem, and therefore the Leda of this newborn slave will not require the bris to take place on the 8th day. You need to do it immediately. Says the Gemara, this works well according to the view that holds kinyan peris, when a person purchases peris, produce of a field, offspring of a shivcha, lav ke kinyan guftami. It is not considered like he has an actual acquisition in the primary object. But according to the sheet that holds, when one has kinyan peris, an acquisition of the produce of offspring, it is regarded as though he's actually acquiring an element in the primary object. It's a kinyan haguf. It's as though he's acquiring part of the shivcha herself. Michael Amema. What can we say then? Because if he has possession in the shivcha herself, it's considered to be like a conventional leda, like an ordinary childbirth. And there's dumi lachem, it's his childbirth. It's his shivcha, so to speak, that's giving birth. Therefore, the bris should take place on the 8th day. Says the Gemara of Shiur, we're speaking about a different case. B'leikeach shivcha, he purchased this slave maiden. Al manas with a condition. Shalei atfila. It was conditional. He's not going to have her immersed in a mikveh. She's not going to be obligated in the mitzvahs like a Jewish woman. In which case, Rashi explains, this is not considered to be your standard shivcha. It's not dumi telachem. She's not going to have mitzvahs like a Jewish woman. It's not like you. It's dissimilar to the yid who has mitzvahs. And therefore, this case does not require the child to have his milah on the 8th day. So in summary, we learned that a newborn slave, whether he's a miknas kesef purchased by the Yisrael, or whether he's a lid bayis, unpurchased but born into the Jewish home, there's a chiyuv to do milah on this child. We have one pasuk which tells us the milah takes place on the 8th day. When it's dumi telachem, it's similar to the Jewish born child. We have another pasuk which tells us it's not necessarily on the 8th day. It takes place immediately. So what are these 4 cases being described in the psukim? Tanakama says that miknas kesef of a bris on the 8th day is referring to, he purchased a shivcha who was already muberes, already expecting. So the acquisition pertaining to the uber as well, he's being purchased by the Yisrael. And since she gives birth into the Jewish home, this child is dummi telachem and has his meal on the 8th day. If he purchased a shivcha who's bringing along her child who's already born, this child requires a bris, but on the 1st day, because it's not dummi telachem, he wasn't born within the confines in the household of the Yisrael, he was already born prior to arriving to the Rishus Yisrael. We have 2 cases of yilid bais, unpurchased slave. We have the slave which will have his meal on the 8th day, a case of he purchased a shivcha, and then she was nisaber when she was already in the possession of the Yisrael, she became expectant. In this case, the newborn was not purchased by Yisrael, it's a yilid bais. She gave birth when she was already in the possession of Yisrael. This child is similar to the Jewish born child, he has his meal on the 8th day. If he purchased a shivcha on condition that he won't be matpiler, she won't be total, she will never have her obligations, her mitzvahs like a Jewish woman. She hasn't even begun the process of eventually reaching that point. She has no intention of doing that tefillah. This shivcha is very dissimilar. It's not considered to be lachem, it's not like the Jewish born child, and therefore this child will have his meal on the 1st day. According to Rav Chama, miknas kesef, which will have his meal on the 8th day, is a case where he purchased a shivcha who was already muberes, and she was toivel, which requires her to observe the tumas leda, and then she gave birth. So this child was born from an isha who has tumas leda, so his meal is on the 8th day. Whereas if he purchased an uber independent of a shivcha, Reuven bought a shivcha, Shimon bought an uber, so he purchased the uber, but it wasn't as part of the shivcha, it was independent of the shivcha. Shivcha is not his. So this leda is not considered to be dumei telachem, it's not similar to a Jewish born child. It's not his birth, it's not the Yisrael's birth, and therefore this child will have his meal immediately on the 1st day. The case of a yilid bayis who has his meal on the 8th day is a case where he purchased a shivcha, she became nisaber, expecting when she was in his rishus, then she was toivel, so she has tumas leda, and then she was moila, she gave birth. In this case, the child has meal on the 8th day. If, however, she gave birth and then she was tovel, she has no tumas leida. In this case, the child will have his mila on day 1. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. We have 4 cases of suffix, in which case the mila will not take place on Shabbos. A child who is a suffix if he's an 8-month fetus, in which case he won't survive, he's not viable. We have an androgynous. We have a child who was born bein hashmashas, in which case we're not sure which day is the 8th day. We have a child who is noilad kishuhu mohol, in which case the atavas dam bris is only on account of suffix and can't be done on Shabbos. What is the halacha of a noilad kishuhu mohol? Tanakama maintains that Beis Shammai require hatavas dam bris, and Beis Hillel don't. According to Shimon and Lazar, both hold that we need hatavas dam bris. Rabbah says this whole concept is only a suffix erla. According to Rav Yosef, it is a vada erla and is meant to be done on Shabbos. Rav Asi tells us that the 8th day bris depends on whether the mother observes Sumas Leida, and we concluded that it's a machlekes tanai.